Nangana mulana yenbana nangana mulana yakapna tungulaja nangana mulana yuringa yuri yerabilla parangrang nangana mulana nukul bukut. Acknowledge all the ancestors that have walked country for thousands of years, the way that they have lived within deep, intricate connection and respect to country. Acknowledge how that was interwoven into ways that were incredibly beautiful, incredibly powerful, incredibly considered in all ways, in all interactions across country, across relationships which we have always been deeply entwined into, to the extent of those relationships also being about ourselves not being separate from those things that we were and are and will continue to be in relationship and connection to. Yorta Yorta Dja Dja Wurrung here. My name is Neil. I am a Yorta Yorata man and also a Dja Dja Wurrung man. I was very blessed to be able to grow up on the country of my people, the Yorta Yorata. My people are incredible. They have been incredible for thousands of years, and they have continued to be incredible. They've been resilient, they've been survivors, they've been fighters, and most importantly, they have always been a people that remember and pay honor to the past that we descend from. And that is indeed crucial for us as First Nations people, to always remember the past that we descend from. We cannot forget the impact that that has for us in the now, the impact that that has on all of the decisions that we make in the now. It is a blessing to have been somebody to grow up on their own lands, in that constant reinforcement, the constant reminder, and also the constant blessing of what it is I do descend from as a Yorta Yorata person and Dja Dja Wurrung. I grew up on Calistraban land of Yorta Yorata country, 2 hours north of so-called Melbourne, in a town you may know of as Marupana, which is a part of a larger township of the name of Shepparton. It is a stunning part of country where there is an amazing water that flows through this place. You may know of it as the Goulburn River. We know of it as Kayla, which means Father Water. Not so far from here, just a little bit down the road, about 60 kilometers away, is another incredible body of water as well, Dhungala. You might know of this body of water as the Murray River. I'm going to share a few things about the history of our people's interaction with country historically, and how that can be linked into the now, and some things about the broader context of indigeneity in the now, and what that can mean for all of us in navigating a lifestyle that is towards zero waste and ultimately the most caring sense of custodianship that we can all play within where we live on country. What is our responsibility? What is our role? So I'm just going to share with you now a PowerPoint with a few slides for you to accompany this talk. So First Nations, green past, green futures. So as we would all be acutely aware, or most likely all acutely aware of, is that First Nations pasts were pre-colonisation entirely green ways of living and existing upon country. The aspirations for a First Nations future have never been ceded. They continue, and as stated, with responsibility for First Nations people, they continue very profoundly. And for someone who have grown up on their own country, that resonance of the need for a green future is a constant reminder that is echoed. So as stated, pre-colonisation was a waste-free way of life, 100% in every way, shape and form, underpinned by what is a relatively well-known understanding of we only took what we needed and we only took what we needed to use. And that underpinned so many decisions within our way of living, the way we constructed our identity and placed ourselves within the ecosystem of existence. So here is an image of Dhungala-Big Water in Yorta Yorata language, aka the Murray River, as mentioned. Dhungala is and has been a central factor as a source of life for Yorta Yorata people, and I cannot do a sharing of this today without touching on the power and importance of something such as Dhungala. Dhungala was created by the directions from Baiyadeera. Baiyadeera you might know of as the Rainbow Serpent, a story that has become familiar with many, a being that many know of. Over so many different parts of country, there are different stories. Over this part of country, Baiyadeera played a role in the formation of Dhungala, this large body of water to cultivate life for many. This is the largest, longest river in this land. And not only for that, but that being one part of why this is such a sacred place, it did provide for so many from different clans of the Yorta Yorata, and also was a benefit to many surrounding groups as well. If you would ever spend some time up on country, up alongside Dhungala, there are incredible examples of the power of the evidence of how First Nations people have interacted with Dhungala in a way that links back to the green pasts of First Nations people, the green pasts of my people, the Yorta Yorata people. There are very telling evidences within the landscape of this. And so the land that we used, the land that we interacted with, the land that we were a part of, was driven by a deep respect of the sacredness and different parts of the landscape were used in different ways to promote this highly sensitive care that our lifestyles were driven by. I'm going to talk a bit today about a particular kind of site known as a midden, and about the centrality of the importance of a midden site within the concepts of waste. And not creating waste. Midden sites, for those who aren't aware, were found nearby to waterways across country. In parts of country where this image is from, you can find a stretch of middens that are quite frequently found. Middens were quite central to community connection, and a midden ultimately is an occupation site where remains from meals were left, and there are also places of gathering. And in some instances, there are evidences of these being places of ceremony. When you consider the deep complexities of our lives and the importance placed on all things, you begin to understand that there was sacred use of these sites. Midden sites were kept clean at all times. There was never any waste left behind. And there were some things such as leaving the waste from previous experiences, previous use of the site upon the site, to give people a reminder of the resources that were used within a particular area. This was done so as to give an indication of how could people effectively use that site in the most considered way that was a part of what was needed, that was a part of a broader spectrum of conservational activities and connection and use of landscape. Here's an example of a shell midden site on a coastal area. And here is one alongside Dhungala. This one is from the far northwest of Victoria. As you can see, the layers there of this shell deposit is quite extensive. Some of these midden sites, they have been found to be thousands of years old, which is quite remarkably powerful to consider the respect to things that had come before and continuing to be binded to the use of those spaces and the respect to how use of those spaces was conducted in a way that was respectful to all ancestors who come before in the use of sites. As touched on, some of these sites, they do contain ochre, they do contain stone artifacts and such. There was a deep connection of middens to many parts of life. Here's an example of another kind of cultural site, or burial ground. Here is another scar tree. These sites all are indicators of different parts of country and different considerations around what should one be doing in a particular part of country that is leading into the green respective country ultimately. And here is some artwork depicting our use of country by one of my ancestors, Tommy McRae, of the Quat clan group of the Yorta Yorata. His artwork showed this amazing sense of resilience to stay connected to past ways of connection to country in the face of the obstacles of colonisation. And as you can see, down in the right-hand corner of this image, you can see that this image was one that was done post-colonisation, and there is this almost eerie sense of non-Indigenous people looking over this scene and potentially pondering what was their place within this, whilst there was this powerful First Nations culture still present and still showing every intent to continuing to be present. And so to think about all of this, we must think about Molety systems. We must think about the understanding of First Nations people being an interconnected part of nature and the kinship systems that First Nations exist within as a broader structure. So we're talking about the spiritual underpinnings that had guided and continue to guide First Nations people, that is etched into our DNA. So another understanding of use of space that's really important, and I really echo this in terms of something that's still relevant, is the use of spaces by initiation, use of country by permissions, and within a broader set of system where we could not freely roam to utilize country for our own benefit without a broader understanding and broader permissions in terms of what our particular role within country as an individual was supposed to be, which is guided by totems, both for individuals and for families. And this is one of the really powerful ways of how ecological consideration for the broader landscape was constructed. And this promoted responsible use for country. And this ties people into place. Here's an example of one of my totems of the Yorta Yorata people, which is Baiyadeera, the long-necked turtle. And a thing I want to touch on here, as you can see in the right image, you see this turtle shell, which has a tracking device on it. So that's an example of the way totemic care has flowed into the now to understand contemporary factors that have impacted on Baiyadeera and how Baiyadeera operates within the landscape, and what we need to do to protect Baiyadeera, which is so critically important. The Molety systems are so critically important to reinforce our appreciation of the sacredness of our lands. And this is part of why we continue to uphold the protection of our totems, such as Baiyadeera. So there were learnings, as stated, from this study around how is Baiyadeera utilizing country and what are things we can do to protect Baiyadeera, such as creating a safer space for Baiyadeera to exist, i.e. through baiting of exotic animals that have threatened Baiyadeera's existence within certain parts of country, largely sand dune systems where Baiyadeera nests. This next part is about applying First Nations methodologies in a contemporary setting, which has been touched on in the previous slides. So we use modern technologies to mitigate against destructive practices, but yet still utilizing and incorporating traditional land management practices and methods into this process. Examples of this are such as landscape restoration practices, also water governance practices, and projects relating to that. And so in talking about technology, we must now consider the role of the urban setting for First Nations people and all others, and consider the role of the custodians in contemporary practices over country, such as cleaning projects of bushlands, recycling and upcycling. The consideration in terms of this is levies placed within regions to help generate some of that First Nations activity. And so how does that continue to happen? A key element to this is increasing the visibility and presence of First Nations people and maximising that where possible. And this is just an example of a piece of artwork on Yorta Yorata country, which includes Sir Douglas Nichols, which is my great-great-grandmother's brother, who is on the left, and William Cooper, who some of you may know of as an incredible First Nations and human rights activist. They both played formidable roles in the history of our people that is connected into the very direct current predicament of First Nations people in this land. Uncle William was a part of the initiation of the Aborigines Advancement League, which was born in Naarm, and his work echoes strongly and loudly in the lives of all of us now. I pay homage to them, and I think it's quite powerful to consider the visibility that's brought of them through this artwork and how that can remind broader society around the need for consideration for the role of First Nations people within all aspects of life, and certainly responsibility to country, which zero waste is a key element of. So a big question of this as well is getting down to particular areas. Where are the custodians? Where are the presence of custodians in one's green activities? Are they present? If not, what are some of the reasons why not? And then what are some of the reasons of how you could find a way to include them? A big part of this is enabling a role for them to lead, understanding that their custodianship of country has not been ceded, just as sovereignty has not been ceded. Responsibility for country will never be ceded as long as First Nations people are alive, and as long as people are living, First Nations people will be here. So one of the core things for First Nations people is to carry out custodianship, and the great need within this is to be able to lead practices around the environment. And so a question around this is this kind of activity resourced? And who is resourcing that? And how, and what is the responsibility for all to play a role in this? Pay the rent is a concept which has been around for quite some time. It's believed that it was quite popularized in the 70s and 80s. And in many circles, it's just now starting to get traction and understanding. And there has now been a pay the rent organization set up in Naarm quite recently, in fact. The pay the rent solution can contribute to a royalty to support custodians of a particular land to empower them to carry out custodianship activities. And it is about what is one's personal contribution as a guest who now might find themselves at home on a particular part of country. How does one directly feed into that? And then how does one acknowledge that they now sit within a cultural landscape in living in the Indigenous lands of so-called Australia. And that by acknowledging them that we're in a cultural landscape, we cannot do that without acknowledging, enabling the space for Indigenous leadership to come to the fore. So a question there is, how does one support Molety systems in the now? We can all support that in some way or another. Here's an image of custodians of Naram, who are the Jiri. And the work that they do is incredible through song and dance and education. And it evokes so much inspiration for people to conduct and carry out their lives in a way that are considered in terms of where do we all fit within responsibility in the now, in living for those that live in Naram. And so a big part of what I'm touching on here is certainly economic participation of First Nations people, and how economic participation is a key driver to ensuring that First Nations people have opportunity to play roles in contemporary green technologies and other methodologies being utilized upon their country to continue their custodianship. A big part of this as well is ensuring that by having this inclusion, that we mitigate against the domination and dominion of potential neo-colonial liberalism, which, as we all know, can potentially perpetuate very quickly and make it quite difficult then for First Nations people to gain adequate opportunity within carrying out their custodianship and being involved in the market of green economies. An economic disadvantage due to colonisation has meant that there's been a reduced participation for First Nations in the broader market of greener technology. So going back to the pay the rent construct, that is one way that we can enable the economic participation of First Nations people and ultimately enable greater opportunity for their custodianship over country that green economies are operating within. Examples of this are ones which have been talked about for many years, which are, for example, bush foods. And then, of course, there are First Nations people entering into the green technology spaces as well. There are First Nations owned and operated energy companies now in existence, and there are many amazing forms of First Nation people contributing to the broader overall picture of where we are currently at, both, as mentioned much earlier in this presentation, in a contemporary way of engaging in traditional methods. We still have entirely traditional methods of caring for country, such as Indigenous burning practices, which are now becoming quite proliferated at a higher rate. And then we have contemporary engagement. And the beautiful thing is that we can have all of those things. But what we get with First Nations participation is thousands of years of connection, thousands of years of drive, thousands of years of responsibility. And when you interconnect that with how can we all move forward into a future that is the most beneficial, it would make sense that those with thousands of years of connection to laws upon this land as the first peoples of this land would play an integral role moving forward into how green economies develop and look like. So modern engagement can look very different. It can take so many shapes and forms. And a large part of that is, again, the visibility. And Indigenous artists are leading the way in reminding people of this visibility as one example. And so in closing, I want to leave you with this last image, which is provided by an incredible artist by the name of Charlotte Allingham. And this, as you can see, is a powerful reminder of the fact that First Nations people hold to the concepts that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land or Indigenous land, where custodianship will always be important. It has shown no signs of relinquishing, and it never will. And it's beautiful. It's incredibly beautiful as First Nations people that we have a blessing to be able to still present forward these impulses, these laws that are still with us. And we have amazing opportunities to work alongside others to understand how the suite of skills of humanity can be utilized in partnership to get the best outcome possible for humanity. But as I say, with much that I'm about as a person, we will not get the best outcome for humanity without understanding the integral role that First Nations people play in the continued survival of people. We've never ceded sovereignty. We've never ceded our laws. We've never ceded our ways. We've never ceded our need to continue to be undertaking things which all of society can benefit from, that all living beings will benefit from. And that creates a beautiful opportunity. It means an opportunity where it's about everybody thriving. It is not about anybody being left behind. And it is truly an honor to be a First Nations person, to be able to be connected to a time in the world where it seems maybe there's a glimmer of understanding of how valuable this is and how valuable our lives can all be, when maybe we do come to a point in history where the sovereignty of First Nations people is not something that needs to be protested, but that is understood and is a part of a greater mechanism of a beautiful society that is more powerful and more beautiful than anybody's been able to experience in modern times. Thank you for listening to my words today. It's been a pleasure to just share a little bit about some historical things and bring your minds into thinking about where First Nations people still are currently within the broader understanding and the broader experience of what green futures mean and what the green now can mean for people. Again, my name is Neil Morris. It's been a pleasure to share with you today from Yorta Yorata country, where I'm sitting and sharing with you. Thank you to Zero Waste for enabling me to share today. I look forward to continuing to have an opportunity to engage with you all in some capacity or another. And I do wish you a really beautiful day, no matter which country you're currently sitting on across this great sacred land of many Indigenous nations. Thank you.